Good afternoon. How are you, Mr. Randeep?
Hi, I'm good.
So, welcome to Saber's podcast, The Sustainability Conversation. It's a pleasure having you with us today as the podcast guest for our very first podcast episode. We have seen your remarkable work and your vast experience in so many industries. And before we officially begin the podcast, let me start by introducing the two podcast hosts. So, I'm Simran and I handle marketing and communication at Saber.
I'm Tanya, and I handle the business development and operations at Savor, and we'll give you a short introduction to Savor. So Savor is a tech startup started in August 2019 that reduces food wastage and tackles food insecurity by empowering organizations with savings through digitalization via a one-stop B2B e-procurement and sponsorship web app platform.
So we connect B2B customers like nonprofits, companies, and school clubs who are interested to procure for their operations, programs, and events from merchants who are offering various types of expiring, blemished, and surplus, as well as regular food, corporate gifts, office supply materials, and rental services. So customers can place corporate orders listed at bulk, charity, and corporate discounts and apply for in-kind sponsorships in Singapore.
So today is Savor's first podcast episode ever, and our theme for this podcast is sustainability. This is a 4-part podcast session with one session featured each week. We started this podcast series with the aim to get speakers who are experienced and knowledgeable in various particular areas and get them to share about their thoughts, experience, and advice.
So to add on to Tanya, the key objectives of this podcast are to educate our listeners who are general public, the merchants, and B2B customers who are interested in learning more about the various areas of sustainability in Singapore from the industry experts' knowledge and experience in different sectors, and to inspire the listeners on how they can play a role in supporting these sustainability areas and practices.
So we wanted to learn more about sustainability in the context of carbon tax legislation and incentives. Under a carbon tax, the government sets a price that emitters must pay for each ton of greenhouse gas emissions they emit. Businesses and consumers will take steps such as switching fuels or adopting new technologies to reduce their emissions to avoid paying the tax. A number of countries, regions, and local governments around the world have a carbon tax or something similar to an energy tax related to carbon context. So, Mr. Randeep, we wanted to learn more about your experience and perspective as a stakeholder in the current sustainability scene in Singapore and what you're working on in order to comply with the carbon tax legislation in Singapore. So we wanted to know more about your thoughts about what do you think about the legislation and have you benefited personally from the carbon tax incentives?
I think it would help to contextualize our conversation first. So first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. It's quite an honor to be your first guest. I hope to set the bar here, and we'll see what happens with that. So first, let me introduce myself a little bit and my company as well. So my name is Randeep Melhi. I have a background in finance. And I later on pivoted my career towards blockchain. So I've been in the blockchain space since 2014 when I started the global blockchain practice at KPMG in New York. And since then, I've worked on a number of large-scale blockchain ideas, some of which were sustainability related, through which I actually started advising a Canadian company who was producing carbon credits on the blockchain through forestry conservation. So having done that, I partnered with a guy I met here in Singapore, who's one of my co-founders, who has a background in the carbon industry. And together we have started 360 Green last year. What 360 Green is doing, not too dissimilar from the company I was advising, is we are managing forestry projects throughout Southeast Asia in order to produce carbon credits using the latest technology to do it more efficiently, more cleanly, and more traceability, with more traceability than any other project in the world is currently doing. So those are our goals in a nutshell. So having, so you asked me how this legislation has affected us. It hasn't affected us directly to date, but it is gonna, legislation like this is going to increase the demand and therefore the price of the carbon credits that we produce when we do our as we do our forestry conservation projects throughout the region. So we are indirect beneficiaries of this. I guess maybe even direct. It's just that companies in Singapore historically have not put the environment ahead of, high on the agenda historically, and that's something we very much want to see changing.
Okay, thank you. Then I was actually wanting to find out whether you could give any suggestions about how the carbon tax incentive can be improved from your perspective for like the businesses around there, not only in Singapore, but perhaps the world itself.
I say allow companies to buy offsets, right? Rather than just the flat tax. As I said, like I'm in the offsets business. Of course, I think it's a good thing. That's why I got into the business. I think then you can, very, very plainly penalize the companies in any industry who are not being environmentally friendly while giving a boost through the financials of it to the companies who are. So I think that makes a very clear difference. I think one of the problems we have here in Singapore is political will, right? One of the things, part of the model of us being Singapore is kowtowing to the financial interests of big MNCs, and of course they don't want to pay a carbon tax, right? We can never, part of the Singapore models, we can never be a first mover on this because we're afraid that we'll scare away these MNCs that we rely on to come here to create jobs. And so we're going to have to find a balance between, the long-term goal of having, keeping the planet friendly for human life, and the immediate goal, which is, keeping Singapore's economy going.
Okay. That was quite insightful, and we're very interested in what you had to say.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. And so we would have a few questions that we would like to address with you. Absolutely. So the first one is now, what according to you are the economic sectors that carbon tax can hit the hardest, and how do you think the impact can be minimized for these sectors?
So, I think it's going to be very clear that it's going to hit the hard if we have the moral fortitude to do it correctly. Then it's going to impact the most polluting industries the hardest, right? The question is, do people want to be paying a lot more for their beef, for instance? Do people, it's concrete, things like, these are the things that we use for our day-to-day lives, that are people going to be willing to pay more? Because a lot of these companies, let's face it, they're not going to be absorbing this, right? They're going to be passing it on, right? So in the end, it goes down to the consumer prices. So, I mean, and I see that as a good thing, because it means, if you believe in the theory of demand and supply, prices will go up for things that are less environmentally friendly. They become luxury goods. Polluting becomes a luxury good. and then the rest of us who don't sit in the upper echelons of society will have to contend with environmentally friendly products, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But now we have to ask ourselves, like, do we have? It comes down to the willpower, right? So you can pass all the laws you want, but you're always going to have unintended effects.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Also, actually, like you mentioned that how the most polluted industries will be affected, but do you think that the consumer market will be affected as well, seeing how the consumers are also the ones that are paying for like goods such as beef, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? Like, I mean, again, like, is it a carbon tax or is it a greenhouse tax, right? Like cows emit methane, right? Which is 4 to 5 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2, right? And so we're not pricing that in. The entire failure of environmental protection is a failure of capitalism. It's a failure of it's a failure of the tragedy of the commons, right? No one wants to take the first step when when everybody's well-being is at stake, right? That's the problem. So I think, of course, legislation helps, but again, Singapore is just a tiny part of the whole ecosystem. So is it going to solve the problem by itself? No, but it can help. It's going to make people more aware. It's going to make people think about things twice. And yeah, of course, and the hope is that it will affect consumer prices. So something as simple as, if I buy a cheap plastic thing from AliExpress, for $1, right? Like, it's going to take 200 years to decompose. That's not priced in to the good, so that it's just a failure of economics.
Okay, thank you for sharing. So you mentioned how like the consumer goods would be increased because consumer goods be increased because the companies would want to pass on this like tax to the consumers itself. So actually I was wondering how might the changes in food prices vary across the country, or even like not only just in Singapore, but perhaps like bigger countries as well. Do you think there'll be like more countries that'll be more adversely affected?
I mean, there are countries that pollute. I mean, if we do it globally, then everyone will feel the pain. But then again, there are countries that rely more on rely more on dirty industries, right? Like, again, like if you're going to tax cows, then like countries like New Zealand, Australia get very affected. The middle of America gets very affected because these are the big meat exporters. Brazil, another huge beef exporter. So and again, then these governments have to ask themselves, long term versus short term. The problem is when we vote for leaders and we put them in office, it's what, 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, right? It's a short period of time, and these guys, it's more difficult to make 10, 20, 30, 50-year decisions with those regards. So then, yeah, of course, it's going to have disproportionate effects.
Thank you. That was quite riveting. Like, you're right, globally, everyone is feeling the pain, and a lot of people are relying on these industries over here. So, I mean, to follow up, how do you think these carbon legislations and tax are best implemented for businesses?
Again, if it was up to me, I think I would require businesses of a certain size to go through a carbon audit every year, and then require to either offset the amount that the audit says you've emitted X tons, you have to buy X tons of carbon offsets, or then if you really want to punish these guys, then you say, I want 10% more. So if you owe 100 tons, now you're obligated to buy 110 tons of offset. So then again, that's going carbon negative, right, rather than just going carbon neutral. And and then that's the easy way for companies to do it. I mean, Apple has claimed to be carbon neutral since 2007. What does that mean? Does that mean their factories in China and Taiwan are not polluting? Absolutely not. It just means at the end of the year, they cut a check and they say, okay, here's the carbon offsets. We're done. We're carbon neutral. It's lovely.
And do you think these subsidies for renewable energy, they're sufficient, or do you think they can be better to incentivize businesses to transition to it?
I mean, I think it will be. I mean, economics, right? Like, money is the lifeblood of these businesses. So I think that then again, like, it comes down to these businesses can't survive if they don't have the money for it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for that. So would you say that if the business can't survive without this money, then should the government be giving more subsidies in order to incentivize more companies to transition to it?
I'm a free market guy. Again, I come from a finance background. I think if your business cannot survive with being kind to your employees, treating them fairly, treating the environment fairly, then you shouldn't have a business. I think it's very simple. That's how the market works. I think if you require subsidies, if you require in the short term for transitioning, that's fair. I understand that. I'm sympathetic to that, right? But if your business cannot pivot without doing these things, then yeah, the free market says you shouldn't exist. So then you have no business being in business.
Okay, thank you for that. Your answers for all our questions were very intriguing and very compelling. And I have just one more question before we wrap up this podcast series. Because you're actually aware that you are the founder and COO of 360 Green. So we are wondering, what are the sustainability efforts taken by your company here in order to comply with the carbon tax legislations and incentives?
You mean how we are affected? Sorry, could you rephrase that?
Yeah, sure. So like, can you like explain more about like the sustainability efforts that are taken by your companies in order to address this like carbon tax legislations that's being put on you?
We are expecting. I mean, again, like we're a forest conservation company, right? So obviously, being environmentally friendly is in our DNA in everything that we do. And what we do is we sit between the landowners, who are typically governments, and the carbon markets, and we kind of play that role in between, where we help these landowners monetize their land through conservation, through carbon credits, and then be able to access these carbon markets. Again, like we realize that there's a huge disconnect, which is why we exist as a company, because there is that gap for us to fill. Now carbon legislation around the world, I think, is just going to drive demand for what we do. To help, from producing the carbon credits to even helping companies calculate their carbon footprint. We are working with a specialization in one or two industries. We're working towards helping these industries, some of the biggest, most polluting industries, more easily quantify their carbon footprint, so that then they can just go and offset. I think I dream, and it's already happening, but I dream of a world where every time you make a purchase, there's an option when you check out where you can click it saying, I want to add 40 cents or whatever to offset the carbon from either having this delivered or even from the manufacturing of whatever you're buying. So I think legislation is a step in the right direction, but it's not the solution, which I will say, in fairness to the legislators, they are well aware of this. They know it's part of a suite of tools that are going to be the solution, but they know it's not a be all and end all in itself.
Okay, thank you for that answer. No, would you say that taxing carbon would be regressive on the economy?
No, actually I don't. I think, as I said, like I think a lot of the, you think about the carbon footprint of an individual. If you look at the charts, it tends to go up very, very steeply with your income. Right? Like when a billionaire flies on a private jet, that's way more polluting than me, even if I were to fly first class or business class, right? It's significantly more bigger footprint, right? Like, then if you're going to have, luxury goods, what do those entail, right? Like how, the finest foods and this and that. So it is regressive to a small, I don't think it's regressive, actually. Let me scratch that. I don't think it's regressive. I think, people who, is it gonna hurt everyone? Yes, but it's gonna hurt the people at the top more. It's gonna hurt them more, but you're right in the sense that it might be a smaller portion of their income. They're still gonna fly their private jet. If they have to offset, they'll offset. If they have to pay a carbon tax, they'll pay it. But then those taxes can then go back to help the people who are suffering. If you're doing it in a smart way, right? In Singapore, we love our GST. That's also highly, highly regressive, right? We put an undue burden on the poor in this country, and yeah, this can certainly be used to kind of ease the pain on some of that.
Okay. And now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective is it? And like, do you think it's enough? Is carbon tax enough to address the horrible problem of climate change that we are facing?
Absolutely not. There's so much that needs to be done. If you think anybody who thinks a bunch of old legislators sitting around in a room passing a law is going to solve the environmental crisis is very, very delusional. And I would, I would love to know what they were on. No, absolutely not. It's going to take a lot more than that. It's going to take the willingness of the people. No one can force this upon you. We, as it needs to come largely from businesses. A lot of people, I think one thing I like, no, I don't like it, but I'm very impressed by, for the last 25, 30 years, corporations have been putting the blame on individuals. And I think it was a very artful thing that they did, although it's horrible. For things they are responsible, they were convincing us that we need to recycle, that we need to buy this or buy that, or, as individuals, whereas the vast majority of any environmental impact will be at the corporate level. That's where it's going to be. They've convinced us as individuals that we are personally responsible. As in all the individuals in the world, if we acted right and we did the right thing all the time, it's not going to move the needle enough unless we involve the corporations who have somehow shirked responsibility, about environmental things. Now I order something online, you definitely had this, where the item is this big and the packaging is the amount of plastic that it comes with. It's just because, again, because there's no consequence. These companies don't care, right? Nobody questioned when 1 year ago when COVID broke out, or a year and change now, nobody questioned the rate at which the plastic masks were coming out. Now they're all floating in the ocean, right? And they're going to take hundreds of years to decay. They're still going to be there. They're going to be an environmental problem for a while. So it's these, it comes down to these corporations. So if you ask me on a scale of 1 to 10, it's the tax alone is maybe a 3 at best. But it is making these companies start to think about this, which is good, right? Companies at the end of the day are run by people. There's groups of people, right? So that needs to change. So I remain cautiously optimistic.
Okay. And if there are organizations out there who want to take particular measures or steps to comply with these carbon tax legislations, how do you suggest they should do it?
I mean, if it's, I mean, it's the law. I don't think compliance is optional then, assuming it's passed. But what I would like, what I think they should do is again, understand your carbon footprint, get an audit in, understand, saying my company at this size, this is roughly our annual carbon footprint, then go out in the market or engage with a company who deals with the carbon market and say, okay, fine, if our footprint is 1,000 tons of carbon a year, let's buy 1,000 offsets. All right, and then that's the easiest short-term way to do that. And then again, if they want to go above and beyond, saying, okay, I owe 1,000, let me buy 1,200, because this money goes back into these projects that are actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's the easiest way. Again, no one's asking them to be more environmentally friendly, but there is a cost. So all you have to do is open your checkbook, So I think that's something companies can do.
Okay. Thank you. It was a very great experience having you here as the first podcast guest. It was a enthralling session with super interesting answers, and we have learned a lot, and we're pretty sure our audience will end up learning a lot from this podcast as well.
Yeah,
well,
definitely.
Thank you very much for having me.
Definitely, thank you. It's a very enthralling session where we indeed really learn a lot in terms of what your company does, and also what companies and individuals can do in order to solve this issue of climate change. And this brings us to the end of our first episode of the podcast. So stay tuned for our other podcast guests who will be appearing in our subsequent podcast episodes. If you like what you're listening to, do follow us on our podcast platforms to be updated when our podcast episodes are released every Wednesday at 5 p.m. The Sustainability Podcast series is on Spotify Podcast, iTunes Podcast, YouTube, IGTV, and Facebook videos. And do share this podcast with your network if you think that they'll be beneficial. Thank you.